Hello everyone. We have a long story to explore tonight. One of heroes, monsters and great deeds. A story that will take us to a world of fantasy and also to our own past to discover the society, the tradition, the culture that produced this epic story. So, without waiting more, please find a comfortable position and let yourself go. Just focus on what I say. Because we are getting started right now with the story, The Legend of Beowulf. Once upon a time, so long ago that the north of Europe was still pagan, and people there worshipped multiple exotic gods, there was a king of the Danes called Hrothgar. Hrothgar was a Scylding, and the Scyldings were a clan of Danish kings, all descending from Scyld or Skjold, one of the first kings of the Danes. This clan, this dynasty, had conquered Denmark and beyond, Sweden, the north of Germany, parts of Great Britain. Hrothgar was powerful and respected, so much so that he was surrounded with a court of warriors of great value. He had a beautiful wife, and together they all lived in the great hall that Hrothgar had built for his court, the Hall of Heorot. Life at Heorot was happy. The king and his warriors spent a lot of time hunting and eating by day, or singing and celebrating by night. And so days, weeks, months, seasons, years passed in joy and harmony. But not for everyone. Near the Hall of Heorot lived a monster, a big creature called an Jotun, also known as a troll. His name was Grendel. Most Jotuners, the trolls, lived away from humans and from gods, some of them in Jotunheim, the land of the Jotun. But sometimes one would wander the earth, and this was the case of Grendel. Few ever saw him and survived, and the ones who did were so terrified that they did not remember well what he looked like. So we don't know exactly, but he was enormous, terrifying, and very aggressive, always ready to attack humans who bothered him. It was said that Grendel was a descendant of Cain, the firstborn of Adam and Eve, who had also become the first murderer when he killed his brother Abel, and he was punished for this to a life of wandering. So Grendel lived near Heorot, and each night he was annoyed by the singing and the screams of joy that came from the king's hall. It was too noisy, and his sinister nature did not tolerate expressions of joy. So one night, Grendel lost patience and attacked the hall, just as its inhabitants had gone to sleep. Grendel was very strong. His skin was hard as stone, so weapons could not harm his flesh, and it was a massacre that night. Several of King Hrothgar's men died, before finally Grendel retreated. But the following night he came back, and again the night after, making Heorot an unlivable place, where the king and his surviving people now lived in anxiety. And at night they lived in terror of the monster's attack. The sounds of happiness that once came from the hall had disappeared, and only silence, a heavy silence, had replaced them, occasionally troubled by the terrified screams of the survivors, or the growl of Grendel at night, when he went back to capture and kill more humans. As these tragic events unfolded, the news that the king of the Danes' Hall had been invaded by a monster spread, and it reached Geatland, the kingdom of the Geats, in the south of what would one day become Sweden. Among the Geats lived a young warrior, Beowulf, who was eager to show his worth and wanted to live a life of adventure. When he heard of Hrothgar's problem, he quickly decided this was his chance, and he went to the king of the Geats to ask for permission to leave his homeland, and this permission was granted. Beowulf took a few companions with him, and together they sailed to the Hall of Heorot, where King Hrothgar and the monster Grendel awaited them. When they arrived to the king's court, they were received with open arms, but also skepticism. How would they do anything against a monster that the best warriors of Hrothgar had not been able to even wound? But it couldn't hurt to receive reinforcement, and they were invited to spend the night at Heorot. That night, once darkness had engulfed the king's hall, Grendel returned to terrorize the court and kill a human or two. But Beowulf was waiting, feigning sleep, and as soon as the monster passed close enough, he leapt up to grab him. Beowulf carried no weapon, because he wanted to prove he was Grendel's equal, or even stronger. And the monster fought with his bare hands, so Beowulf would do the same. The monster was surprised at this little man who dared to defy him with no weapon, instead of fleeing or trembling like the others. But this only made Grendel more furious, and the fight began. Beowulf's companions tried to help him, but their swords could not pierce Grendel's skin, and instead of trying to wound him with a blade, Beowulf tried another approach. He grabbed Grendel's arm and pulled on it with all the strength he could find within himself. For a time that seemed to last forever, Beowulf kept pulling and forcing the monster's shoulder, while Grendel tried desperately to get rid of him with his other arm, but unsuccessfully. And suddenly, there was a big cracking sound, followed by a second of silence, and immediately after, a scream of pain. The shoulder and arm of Grendel had been ripped from his body. a monster ran back to his lair in the nearby marshes, where he later died. In Herat, all could not believe their eyes. The monster had been slaughtered, and the nightmare was over. Grendel's arm was displayed at Herat for all to see that the monster had died, and that Beowulf was a fierce warrior. Was it the end of the story? No, far from that. So, again, make yourself comfortable. Let the tension go in your shoulders, slowly, and just let me do the work. Before we go on, remember that you can fall asleep whenever you feel like it. You can always come back later. There are timestamps for that if you wish to resume the story. They are in the description box and the first comment pinned under this video. Together with them, you will find links to alternatives to listen to my stories. There are more and more of them. You can listen to them in streaming on Spotify, Apple Music, and other music streaming apps. They are posted there without sound effects during or after the end of the story. So, if this is what you prefer, you can go listen there. You can also download and listen to everything on Patreon if you wish to support this channel. This helps me minimize advertising whenever possible, and you get plenty of perks like the tracks with different background sounds, surveys, previews, announcements. And finally, for a different take on the narration, you have Lights Out Library and La Biblioteca de los Sueños, the two new podcasts in American English and Spanish respectively, where Olimpia retells the stories. Lights Out Library already has more than 10,000 listeners per week on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So we are excited to keep growing the library of stories and soon bring exclusive stories to this podcast. So if you want to explore all this, the links are in the description and the pinned comment. And now, let's go on with the story of Beowulf before I tell you about its roots and historical and literary significance. Now that Grendel was no more, King Hrothgar and his surviving warriors could enjoy the whole of Herat again. Beowulf the Geat was thanked profusely as much as he deserved, and offered treasures to take back home. He was also invited to stay in the kingdom for as long as he wished, and for him to be comfortable, he was given a separate lodging near Herat. But what all of them ignored was that Grendel was never alone. He had family. Near the marshes where Grendel had settled, there was a lake, and under the waters of this lake, there was a cavern where lived Grendel's mother, another terrifying creature. When she discovered her son had been killed, she sought revenge, and just the night after Grendel had been slain, she herself went to Herat, surprising the king and his followers in their sleep after their celebration of Beowulf's victory. Grendel's mother killed one of Hrothgar's most loyal warriors, Aegir, before escaping and returning to her secret lair in the cavern under the lake's waters. The next morning, Beowulf and his men were called to help again. It seemed the display of Grendel's arm at Heorot had infuriated Grendel's mother even more, and Beowulf was responsible for it, so it was only fair that he protected the king's hall again. The party with King Hrothgar, Beowulf, and their men went after the monster. They followed her tracks, and they arrived at the lake. The tracks disappeared on the shore, and they understood that the fight would have to take place here, under the waters. Beowulf volunteered to go fight Grendel's mother. Before diving, he stipulated conditions to Hrothgar in case he would not come back, including that his companions would be taken in. And then he jumped into the cold waters of the lake. Under its peaceful surface, this lake was full of monsters. There were flesh-eating fish, water serpents, and these animals started harassing Beowulf as soon as he was underwater. But the hero kept swimming all the way down to the bottom, and he found the entrance to the cavern, the hideout of Grendel's mother, where there was air and he could breathe. But as soon as he entered, he saw her face to face, and the combat began. It turned out to be very difficult for Beowulf, and soon even desperate. His sword could not hurt her, and his bare hands neither. Her skin just seemed impossible to wound. Beowulf even narrowly escaped death when she tried to kill him with a short sword, and he was saved only by his armor. As the fight went on, and Beowulf was starting to feel exhausted, he spotted another sword hanging on the wall. Apparently it was a sword made for Eotenus, definitely not human in origin. Given that his own sword was useless, he decided to switch. He managed to take it, and it turned out this new sword could harm Grendel's mother. Now that she no longer was invincible, he could prevail, and soon he could cut her head off with the Eoten sword. As he was catching his breath, Beowulf discovered the corpse of Grendel in a corner of the cavern that his mother had transported here. He also severed Grendel's head, and now that Grendel's mother had been eliminated too, peace could finally return to the hall of Heorot and King Hrothgar's court. Beowulf swam back to the edge of the lake. He presented the proofs of his victory and received many more gifts from Hrothgar, the most precious of them being the king's sword, Naegling, that had belonged to the clan of the Seedlings for generations. Beowulf would soon be ready to return home with all his gifts that made him a rich man, his new sword, and, most importantly, the glory he had acquired. In the hall of Hrothgar, life would return to normal. the laughs and the songs would soon be heard again at dusk, as the nightmare brought upon the hall by Grendel and his mother gave way to a new time of hope and happiness. This is not the end of Beowulf's exploits. He will soon be back and have to face a more formidable enemy. But let's take a moment to have a look at this epic story. Where does it come from? How do we know it? And what does it tell us? Beyond the story itself and the action. You may have noticed something a bit odd. The story takes place around the 6th century in pagan Scandinavia. We know it from the names or the places. But at the same time, you remember Grendel on top of being an Eoten, a type of being from Germanic mythology, of which Norse mythology is a part of. Eoteners are also called Jotuns in Scandinavia, a term that is often translated as giant, even though this is not a very good translation. Because rather than enormous creatures, like the term giant invites to imagine them, the Jotuns were more like regular-sized humanoids, maybe imposing but not enormous. They supposedly looked a lot like humans, but they were a different species, a different kind from humans. Their appearance is unclear. The way they were described depended on the traditions and the places, since they are mythical creatures. But the point is that, together with the story of Beowulf, its characters, its places, its references, the Eotuns belonged to pre-Christian Germanic culture or mythology. And yet, there is this reference to Grendel being a descendant of Cain, the first murderer from the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament of the Christians. Cain was a man, and this reference originated in the Middle East, thousands of miles away from the regions where Germanic peoples lived. So how is that possible? It is possible because the version of Beowulf that we know of, the oldest written version, is from a manuscript produced in England at the turn of the Second Millenium, between 975 and 1025 AD, about 1,000 years ago for us. This manuscript was written at a time when England had been Christianized for several centuries already, and written culture, the production of manuscripts, was deeply tied to religion, to monasteries that were the main centers of production and conservation of knowledge and literature. So, the story enclosed in this manuscript is clearly of Germanic and pagan origin, but it is looked at through this Christian lens. It was written down at a time when Christianity dominated, by copyists, by scribes, who were most probably Christians themselves. And this is where the reference to Cain comes from. It was a way to Christianize it, in a sense. It sounds likely, but that's a topic of discussion between scholars, that the Christianization of this story also affected it in more subtle ways. For example, the glorification of pagan characters, may have been toned down. There could have been an injection of moral principles that were not in the original version. The balance of the story could have been changed in ways that are not easy to find out, to disentangle after so much time. But let's take some of these questions in order. And first, why a pagan Germanic tale written in England? Because, as you know, England in the second half of the first millennium was dominated by Germanic peoples that had come from the continent. The most famous of these peoples being the Angles and the Saxons. In England, these Germanic settlers mixed with a local population that had a Celtic and Roman culture. The Roman Empire left important traces in England, but it was present for less time than in the rest of Western Europe, if you compare it with Spain or France. And this Roman presence did not fully transform the local culture out of a limited number of urban centers. For centuries, England of the post-Roman period was strongly influenced by Germanic culture. In a local variant of this culture, because of the distance with the continent and the variety of Germanic peoples. These differences started with the language. In the 3 last centuries of the first millennium, the dominant language in England had become Old English, also called Anglo-Saxon, a Germanic language that, after many influences and the passing of time, would one day become English. But don't imagine Old English or Anglo-Saxon as a kind of archaic English that a modern English speaker could vaguely understand. It worked and sounded really very different, not just the words, but also the structures. So, at best, it would be possible to pick a word here and there, and it takes years of study to be able to correctly translate Old English. Before Old English, the languages spoken in Roman Britain, in England, were Common Britannic, which was a Celtic language. It had different regional dialects, and to a lesser extent there was Latin, brought by the invaders and occupiers that stayed for decades in Britain, all the way north to the frontier with Scotland. With the decay of Roman power and presence, the proportion of Germanic settlers coming from the continent, especially from the coasts of the North Sea, this proportion increased to the point that Germanic people became dominant in England. Common Britannic died down, and with it the presence of a Celtic language in England almost disappeared, except in peripheral parts of England. And so it was replaced by Anglo-Saxon Old English, which was a West Germanic language, a branch of Germanic languages. Its closest relatives in the family of languages were Old Frisian and Old Saxon, spoken on the continent. Old English itself had dialects, regional dialects. There were 4 main ones: Kentish, Mercian, Northumbrian, and West Saxon, the language of the Kingdom of Wessex. These dialects had different fortunes. West Saxon, for example, influenced a lot the literary production in Old English in the last centuries of the first millennium. North of England, there was this Northumbrian dialect that strongly influenced Northern English, which centuries later evolved into Scots in Scotland, where it displaced Gaelic, the Celtic language that previously dominated in Scotland. But the one dialect that became the base of Middle and Modern English in the following centuries would be Mercian. But returning to the progressive formation of the English language, I was telling you that by the 6th, 7th centuries, Old English, Anglo-Saxon, now dominated in England, and this domination lasted well into the 11th century. In the meantime, England received yet another shot of Germanic culture or Germanic language in the 9th and 10th centuries with the Norse, the Viking invasions coming from Denmark and Norway mostly. Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, belonged to another branch of Germanic languages, and so it shared similarities with Old English. The end of the era of Old English domination is traditionally dated to the Norman invasion of 1066. William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, landed in England and took possession of the country. The Normans, the new masters of England, brought with them their dialect of French, and the new language of the elites in England became Anglo-Norman in the 11th and 12th centuries. Anglo-Norman did not eradicate Old English, that remained popular, but with the passing of generations, it influenced it strongly, to the point that Old English evolved into a language different enough to be considered separate, Middle English. The direct ancestor of modern English and the dominant language spoken in England during the second half of the Middle Ages. This Norman influence distanced much more English from the Germanic languages it originally came from. So, if we want to position Beowulf within this timeline, at the time when the Beowulf manuscript we have was produced, we were at the turn between the 10th and 11th centuries, at least 50 years before the Norman conquest, in a country that was still dominated by Old English, and also by the Christian faith, which at the time, the end of the 10th century, had almost completely eradicated all the Celtic beliefs. Maybe apart from a few exceptions, they had not survived the installation of Christianity. The manuscript was written using a version of the Latin alphabet, which is normal because for almost 300 years already, this alphabet was used to write Old English. There are a few known inscriptions in Old English that used a runic system, but this system was replaced by Latin letters from about the 8th century. All this lengthy historical explanation was for you to visualize a bit better where Beowulf comes from. We know the story in Old English from a manuscript produced in England, one of the oldest such manuscripts, so it can be regarded as one of the first pieces of English literature. but it is also the product of many generations of Germanic peoples in England, of Germanic myths and stories, of epic poems that told the stories of heroes and expressed the outlook on the world, on the divine, on life and death of ancient Germanic peoples. The same story, or other versions of the same story, could well have circulated in much of Germanic-dominated Western and Northern Europe, which by the end of the Western Roman Empire was almost all of Western Europe. Germanic peoples had migrated to all these regions and created new kingdoms, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes in England, the Franks in France, the Visigoths in Spain and in Italy, together with the Ostrogoths. There were the Vandals too, who went all the way south to North Africa via Spain and then back to Europe. All these tribes were different from one another, but they carried with them a common cultural, mythological background, the one that already dominated in what would become Germany and the Nordic countries in Scandinavia. So here is our connection between Beowulf, England, where this story circulated and was written down, and this Scandinavian pre-Christian setting of the story. In the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, England and Scandinavia were part of the same extended cultural area. Now, Germanic peoples certainly had various epics like this one. Many of them were probably forgotten forever because they were not put in writing, or maybe they were later and the writings were lost. We don't know whether the story of Beowulf was a well-known major piece of their storytelling tradition, like the Odyssey for the ancient Greeks, for example, or whether it was just a secondary, obscure tale that paled in comparison with other more popular stories that we wouldn't know of. There is a lot of mystery surrounding Beowulf for this reason. It looks a lot like the tip of an iceberg, a mythological iceberg that was transmitted essentially orally and mostly got lost. By the way, this also happened to a branch of Germanic mythology, which is Norse mythology. We know most of what we know about it from late medieval writings, the Eddas, that were produced in Iceland, but they probably contained just a fraction of what existed in Norse mythology. And like for Beowulf, when these Eddas were written, the beliefs and traditions they expressed were already disappearing. They were being replaced by new languages, new cultures, and a new faith. I will have more things to tell you about the text itself. But for now, let's go back to the story. We are only halfway through it. After his exploits at the court of King Hrothgar, the slaying of Grendel and his mother, Beowulf had returned to the kingdom of the Geats. Years passed, and as Beowulf had become a respected warrior, he eventually became king of the Geats. More years passed, decades even, and Beowulf became an old man who still remembered vividly his exploits in service of Hrothgar. But the days of adventure now seemed long gone for him. Until one particular day, just 50 years after his battle with Grendel's mother. Inside his kingdom lived a dragon who was asleep peacefully in his lair inside a mountain, where it had amassed a fabulous treasure. But only a fool would have approached the dragon's lair, as the creature was terrifying. It looked like a giant lizard with wings, and it could spit fire. One day, a slave, a careless slave, ventured into the dragon's lair and stole a beautiful cup of gold with jewels. Was it due to a faint noise, or just the dragon's intuition? This theft woke up the monster. Seeing that a little piece of his treasure was missing, the dragon entered in a destructive rage. Flying over the land of the Geats, the dragon started to burn their homes and their lands randomly, including Beowulf's home. By chance, the king was not in it when it happened. Peace and tranquility had been broken in the kingdom of the Geats, and so Beowulf decided to fight and kill the monster. He and his thanes, his lords, gathered and climbed to the dragon's lair, where the monster was taking a break from its destructive raids. But the beast was so frightening that as soon as they saw it, all the thanes but one, a particular brave lord called Wiglaf, all the thanes escaped in terror. The old king and Wiglaf started fighting the dragon alone. But on top of being enormous, the animal was heavily armored with its scales, and its claws and teeth were more dangerous than any sword could ever be. Beowulf was no longer the vigorous young man he once was, and after a long fight, the dragon managed to wound him severely, fatally even. Beowulf looked at his wound in incredulity, and the dragon already felt the taste of victory. But at this very moment, Wiglaf, the only thane left, attacked from behind and wounded the dragon between two scales. The monster was furious. He turned back, and Beowulf seized the opportunity. He drew his dagger and plunged it into the dragon's heart. The monster fell and died. Once again, Beowulf had saved the day, but for the last time. The old king was losing blood, his strength was abandoning him, and the will to kill the dragon that had kept him alive for a few more moments was now gone. With Wiglaf by his side, Beowulf closed his eyes and expired near the dragon's corpse. And so ended the life and heroic story of Beowulf on this last exploit. So there's a lot to say, but first you probably recognized this dragon. Lizard-like, spitting fire, winged. It is a main source, maybe the most important one, in the establishment of the canon of the fantasy dragon, of the kind you can find in Tolkien's work. Actually, Tolkien the author of The Lord of the Rings, knew Beowulf very well. He was an expert in it, and this epic was one of his sources of inspiration. He took elements from it, elements of world building, as we now say, and also something of the structure itself. The way I told you the 3 fights of Beowulf is not really how the poem is written. It follows the same chronology with these 3 exploits, Grendel, then Grendel's mother, and finally, 50 years later, the dragon. But before and in between them, there are plenty of digressions that are not really necessary to the story. There is a prelude that starts with the funeral of a Danish king. There are descriptions. After the slaying of Grendel's mother, King Hrothgar starts a long sermon that is more like a moralizing talk than anything story-related. So it is a bit like trying to retell the story of the Trojan War based on just the Iliad. The Iliad is a main source for the story of the Trojan War, but if you take it how it is presented, you have essentially plenty of digressions, like lists of ships, of troops, of people, that don't really bring much to the story itself. And the Iliad only covers a few days of this long war. So if you want to tell the Trojan War and make it understandable and interesting, you have to eliminate many parts of the Iliad or summarize them very quickly. And you have to expand other parts. But what these digressions do, in the Iliad, like in Beowulf, is flesh out the world in which the action happens. It gives it a sense of depth. It makes it credible and real in a sense. Tolkien, and after him the majority of authors in modern fantasy, were strongly inspired in that sense by Beowulf. Fantasy books are almost always full of this world-building information that is not necessary to the story, but gives it a credible and appealing background. Anyway, the inspiration that Tolkien drew from Beowulf to create Middle-earth and The Lord of the Rings is a topic in itself. The names of races like Ents, Orcs, Elves, the names of people, of places, the structure of society, the style, a lot of it was taken from Beowulf, and more broadly from Germanic mythology and traditions, as they were understood in the 19th and 20th centuries. Like other antique epic poems, Beowulf begins in the middle of action, in medias res, as it is called. It was the same for the Odyssey or the Iliad, and I told you about the narrative structures of these in the previous stories. We have it again here in Beowulf. It is first and foremost the story of a hero, an epic tale. But instead of starting the story with this hero, which could make sense, we begin with a prelude at the court of Hrothgar, with the invasion of the Hall of Heorot by Grendel. And only after that the hero is introduced. This has actually become a very common formula, an approach to writing in contemporary books and films. If you take the majority of modern thrillers, adventure or horror films, cop shows, courtroom dramas, they often begin with a scene that takes you straight into the action before the opening credits, and only after do we discover the main characters and understand that the first scene was an introduction to what the development of the story will be, or a way of introducing characters by showing what they do, rather than telling it, which is always a good way to avoid tedious exposition and also hook viewers at the same time. Now it is likely that this narrative structure was already present in the oral tradition of Germanic people who created and transmitted the story. But there is always a doubt, because the first version we know was produced later. It is always possible that the persons who wrote the story down took liberties and made changes to the structure. Based on the writing and the style, it is established that two different writers, two different scribes worked on the manuscript. And here we touch on the religious and cultural context of English society between the 7th and 10th centuries. The Christianization of England was completed around 700 AD. Completed means that Christianity dominated, not that every single person followed it. Many authors dated Beowulf, the creation of the story, not the manuscript, to the 8th century for that reason, because according to them, the story, the characters, retain a lot of the pagan Anglo-Saxon culture that declined fast after 700 AD. Among the various debates about Beowulf, one is about how pagan and how Christian it is. Is it an old, almost pure Germanic pagan story with a superficial Christian layer, like the connection between Grendel and Cain, or the fact that Beowulf, being a pagan character, despite his bravery, there can be no happy end for him and he dies? Or is it almost the opposite? Is it a story written by and for Christians about their pagan ancestors or relatives? As we saw before, the manuscript is from around the late 10th century to the early 11th century. This is 300 years after the Christianization of England. So there is little doubt that the story of Beowulf circulated in a society that was no longer pagan. But this doesn't mean the heroic quality of the story and the appeal of a world of wonders were no longer attractive to the Anglo-Saxons. The story of Beowulf, like other epic poems, not only Germanic, the Greek ones too, were first and foremost destined to be performed rather than read. They were told in front of an audience. Part of the work of scholars who study texts and societies from these periods is to try and recreate, to understand how this was done. Was it a kind of theater with actors? Was it just one person telling it quietly around a fire? There are many aspects of the cultural and social practices of this period that we ignore, and that are subjects of speculation, of guessing. So the debate about the nature of this version of Beowulf that we know of is going on. Some see it as one of the last expressions of a pagan tribal society that was disappearing but happened to put this text in writing before it was forgotten, and others see it more as a Christian story, or a story for Christians, set in a pagan context. And if this is true, it could also mean that the Beowulf we know has been amputated of different parts that did not pass the Christianity test. For example, in this story, there are supernatural creatures, like Grendel the Jotun, his mother, she has powers too. There is a dragon. There is also a bit of magic, to a limited extent. For example, the sword that Beowulf uses to kill Grendel's mother. But Beowulf is not heavy on magic and miracles. There is no divine intervention of any kind, and this is surprising for an epic poem. If you think about the Norse sagas or Greek myth, gods are often protagonists. They intervene to help or stop heroes. They fight between them. They create things. And this was also the case in Germanic myth that we know of. In Beowulf, in comparison, this world and the forces at play in the story look quite realistic. It is not heavy at all on artifacts and magic. There are no gods to be seen, except as the object of Beowulf's prayers. Sometimes he prays to an unspecified higher single god, a Father Almighty. This is really not what a real pagan warrior would do. Rather than imagine this as the creation of Germanic poets, it is tempting to see Beowulf as a Christianized version of an older story, which could have been redacted to suit the criteria of its time. And with this, we return to this uncertainty about whether Beowulf is really a pagan work with a bit of Christian coloring on the side, or the other way around, a story produced by a Christian society that used pagan cultural elements and a pagan setting from its own past to make it colorful, historical, and attractive. We should also not rule out a possible influence of the Greeks and the Romans on the written version of Beowulf. A century ago, it was popular to make comparisons with the Odyssey by Homer or the Aeneid by Virgil. The Aeneid is a long Latin epic poem, strongly influenced by its Greek predecessors, and it tells the story of how Trojan survivors, who narrowly escaped death after the fall of Troy, traveled the Mediterranean Sea and arrived in Italy, where they became the founders of Rome. The Romans never saw this as a historical account. It was a work of fiction to them. But apart from belonging to the same kind of epic, heroic tale, a possible influence of these antique works on Beowulf just comes from their presence in England at the time of its Christianization. Dominant literary language in medieval England, like in the rest of Christian Europe, was Latin, not Old English or other ancient local European languages. The texts that mattered the most, like science treatises, theology, were to be written in Latin first. Greek culture was also discrete in medieval England, but it was present. Educated people learned Greek alongside Latin, and for example, in the late 7th century, the Archbishop of Canterbury was a Greek man, Theodore of Tarsus, who had fled the Middle East, relocated to Rome, and be sent to England as an archbishop. In this period, cultural exchange between the Mediterranean world and Western and Northern Europe was not intense at all. This part of the world had been set back several centuries in time in terms of infrastructure, culture, and standards of living after the fall of the Roman Empire. But there were still tenuous contacts, and the most important of these networks was Christendom, the Catholic Church that was expanding to Europe. And through its structure with all its dioceses and its hierarchy, it connected all regions. That's why beyond the story, the existence of Beowulf tells us of a disappeared world, the time of the Anglo-Saxons in England, of the Christianization of Europe, of the emergence of new states that, for some of them, evolved into modern countries. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England, the Frankish kingdom of Francia, with its western part that became a proto-France, and its eastern part that formed the core of the Holy Roman Empire, centered on Germany and the north of Italy. In the north of Europe, too, by the time Beowulf was put in writing, the Norse were being Christianized and formed kingdoms that still exist, like Denmark and Norway. There could be many more aspects to mention, but one last, maybe, is that Beowulf mixes different types of elements. There is legend, myth, fiction, but also historical elements. King Hrothgar and his dynasty that get a significant exposition in the first part of the poem are generally considered based on the real Silding dynasty from 6th century Scandinavia. There were also archaeological finds in the east of Denmark in the past few decades, in the area where tradition located the Hall of Heorot, the seat of the Sildings, this dynasty to which Hrothgar belonged. And archaeologists found there the remains of 3 mid-6th century halls, large rectangular buildings measuring 50 meters, 160 feet. Nothing proves they were actually the seat of the Sildings and the Heorot depicted in Beowulf. But still, this brings credibility to the idea, the hypothesis, that elements of Beowulf are rooted in the history of Scandinavia. Elements that would have crossed the North Sea, included in stories, or because they were famous by themselves in England and were reused in stories there. We have reached the end of our story for tonight. You can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library if you don't feel sleepy yet. I'll be back soon with another episode, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams.